This is a short video about the new schedules or scheduler added to the HMI, and it differs from the task scheduler because the task scheduler, for example, can trigger on a time or it can trigger on an event like a user logging in. The scheduler or schedules only fires on time. It also has a start trigger and an optional end trigger. Let's look at the schedule here. So create a new schedule, select schedule or group item, we'll discuss in just a moment. And you can also move the order that they execute. Schedules that are on the same time, in this case 5, both execute assuming that they're the same day. They meet the same criteria to fire. They'll execute at the same time. So you can use the move up, move down to reorder the schedules. Schedule is enabled or not. If it's not enabled, it won't fire. This is under script control in case you want to disable it. I have a description. Runtime start is true in this case. So what happens if you start monitoring and the start time has already passed for the day, meaning it's meant to fire on this day, but the end time, if enabled, has not fired, the schedule will execute as though the start time has just fired. And all of these parameters, attributes, are defined inside the help file. Here's the runtime start action. An inhibit is just a point to inhibit the schedule. There's a start group and an end group. If there is no end group, it'll use the start groups, assuming you have an end trigger enabled. Parameters are name value pairs that are associated with a schedule. Each schedule can have its own. The same names can be used across schedules but not inside of schedules. And this is just one way of doing it I did for this example. I define lights off and lights on and false and true for their values. The schedule is set for a time and then a date or day. Select that. Here I just selected every day of the week. I could have excluded whatever day I didn't want. I could have selected daily and said every day at 5. I could have selected monthly and said every month of these 3 months on the 19th. Whatever you wanted to configure it for at a different time. I could have said hourly. I could have put in 0 or 15 and said every hour at the hour or on 15 minutes after the hour to execute the start trigger. On date, I could have said at 5 o'clock on January 1st, June 1st, July 6th is when I want this to execute. This is very helpful when you're using this schedule for a holiday, because typically the dates of the holidays don't change. Sometimes the day before or after the holiday changes, but generally January 1st is always a holiday. In this case, I did set a end trigger at 2350. The end trigger must always be greater than the start trigger. If you need a schedule that begins, for example, at 10 p.m. or 2200 hours and ends at 200 hours, then just make 2 schedules and just make one start trigger for each one. One at 2200 and the other one at 2 a.m. And use it as an end trigger, even though it's called the start trigger. It'll do the same thing for you. Now we're going to talk about groups. Groups are groups of rights or actions. Actions are things like log something, open a window, run a script, whatever you want to do. Rights are like writing a point, and in this case I have a start trigger and an end trigger, and I'm saying use parameter, which means whatever schedule is calling this group, in this case it's every day, go to its parameters, get lights on, and use that to write to the variable. And on the end trigger I'm going to use lights off. And if you don't remember the trigger, you can just double click here and it'll show you the triggers for each individual group. And I made these the same names in these two just to for this example, and you'll see why I did it in just a moment. This is not an analog, so there's no triggers for here. If I wasn't using parameters, I could have just set false or true, no action. But in this case I am using parameters. We're not using an action in this case, so it's not enabled. we are saying delay 5 seconds. So after the command is sent to this digital tag, it's going to delay on the start trigger. It's going to delay 5 seconds before it does the next one in the list. So it will do Northern Lights, it'll wait 5 seconds, then it'll do Southern Lights. And I set the same 5 seconds for this one, so it'll wait another 5 seconds, and then it'll execute the action. Actions are any action pretty much that a user can perform. Here I set no delay trigger, but these are all the possible actions that you can fire. It's probably look familiar. There are also all the task actions and mainly the mouse actions. Some of them you probably would want to do from inside of a schedule because they would ask for user input. Like these, for example, would ask for user input. So in the schedule, you select the groups that you want to be associated with this schedule, and you just select the one that you want. You could have 50 or 10 or however you wanted to for this group. If there is no end group, it'll use the start groups if you have a end trigger. So on this one, if you recall, I set this to be every day of the week. And on this one, I set it holiday, same start time. I'm using the same start groups, which is the lights. I've got the same parameters, but as you see, they're both false. Because in this case, on the everyday at 5 a.m., it's going to fire this group lights, and inside that group, it's going to turn on these lights, and it's going to execute this action. And it's going to do that because lights on, if you recall, I set to true for this schedule. Lights on is true. But for holiday, it's going to execute the same time as the everyday. I set the lights on group as false. And I did this because this schedule will execute, and then this schedule will execute, and then all of the writes will occur. And that's because I'm using non-combining. If you look in the help file under non-combining, it talks about if they're non-combining, that if you have one group setting a process variable and another group setting the process variable, before they execute, the last one that told the process variable to do something is the one that will take place. And here's an example. If it's combining and if it's not combining. If it's not combining, it's just one after another, however it was ordered. If it's combining, it looks and says, oh, what was the last one to lamp set to? And it uses that value, regardless if some other group before had turned it to a different state. While we're here, there's verbose logging if you wanted to see what's happening. It'll log many different events, like the different triggers, when the next trigger is, what kind of delay is going on, that kind of stuff. Runtime start pulse delay is a delay that's added because when runtime monitoring start, it sometimes can take several minutes or several seconds for the program to fetch all of the data that's required from external devices. Some will happen very quick. Some of them, like DMP3, may take a while to get those data. This says after runtime start, don't issue the runtime start pulse to the scheduler for up to, I think, about 5 minutes or so. I forget. Yeah, up to 5 minutes. Okay, so the key to this one was that we had an everyday schedule and turns on the lights at 5, turns off the lights at 23:50, except on holidays, because we used the combining nature, and it said, and parameters, and it said to operate on the same group lights, but fetch the values from the schedule, lights off, lights on. So the lights on, the start trigger, where it turns them on for the everyday, turns them off if they're not off already on the holiday schedule. You could, of course, made two groups, one called lights on, one called lights off, had the same items inside the group, and had everyday call lights on group and have the holiday call lights off group. because they're operating on the same North Lights process variable digital, the holiday one would overwrite it as long as the non-combining mode was not true. Combining is by default. That's pretty much it. You can cut, copy, and paste groups. You can cut, copy, and paste actions. You can make new. You can copy this group, select paste. You just have to give it a name. There's your second group. It's very easy and very quick because these execute in order. You can move it up or down to get the order that you want. You can use time. For example, if you have power surges because you're turning lights on, you can wait each one a second, 10 seconds, whatever you need. These parameters inside of these schedules are also, you can also set them from script. So for example, if you had a temperature that you wanted to change to make it warmer or colder at night, for example, when they went off, you could just change the parameter using a script command and change the value of the parameter, which is then used inside of the group to do the write, to do the particular write. There's also a monitor at runtime to monitor the schedules that are enabled and what their next triggers are. Start trigger and an optional end trigger if it's enabled. And that's it.